The train hissed as it pulled into dry willow, exhaling steam like a dying beast. Snow flurried down in soft spirals, brushing against the warped wooden platform, and the boots of townsfolk gathered more out of boredom than purpose. The whole town was the kind that watched every arrival with the hunger of people who hadn't had a fresh story in weeks. She stepped off the last car with care, one gloved hand clutching a small brown satchel, the other smoothing the edge of a faded bonnet. The girl looked no older than 25, thin but standing tall, as if she'd practiced bravery on the journey west and meant to keep it stitched tight to her spine. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, buttoned wrong at the collar, and her boots were worn to the stitching at the toes. The man waiting for her, Edgar Wiles, owner of a pig farm on the outskirts, stepped forward, squinting. She gave him a small smile, offered her name, and tried to hand him the crumpled letter they'd exchanged months back. He looked her up and down like she was livestock he'd been tricked into bidding on. "You ain't what I expected," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "Too soft. Look at them hands. Haven't seen a day's work." Evelyn Rose Mercer froze mid-breath. The paper trembled in her fingers. Around them, heads began to turn. Edgar spat near her boots. "I changed my mind. Don't need no wife who can't carry slop buckets." And just like that, he turned and walked away, boots crunching over snow as the crowd pretended not to be listening, though every breath hovered in the cold with judgment. She didn't cry. Not yet. Just stood there as the wind picked up her hem, as if even the breeze didn't want to touch her. The train wheezed again and rolled forward, taking with it her way back east. Across the street, Thomas Kane stood beside his mule cart, having paused mid-load of fence posts. He was a large man, quiet as dusk, with a beard like wet bark and eyes the color of bitter coffee. He watched the girl, no woman, gather what dignity she could and walk, slow and deliberate, toward town with no one to meet her. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Didn't move. Not yet. Evelyn walked past the saloon, where the piano stammered out something cheerful and off-key. She walked past Hazel Dobbin's general store, where a bell jangled overhead, but no welcome came. Hazel herself leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You from back east?" she asked with a tone dipped in honey and venom. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "That explains the shoes. Ain't made for our dirt. Who were you here for?" "Mr. Wiles," Evelyn said softly, eyes cast low. Hazel clicked her tongue. "Well, he's got himself 3 pigs and a reputation for sour whiskey. You're lucky he passed." She didn't smile as she said it, just watched Evelyn walk on, the way a crow watches roadkill. By sundown, Evelyn had asked at the boarding house, full. The church, locked. She offered to scrub floors at the saloon, but was laughed off by a red-lipped woman who said, "We don't hire charity cases." She ended up behind the church anyway, finding shelter in the lee of the stone wall. The snow had thinned, but the wind gnawed through her coat. She tucked herself against the foundation, clutching her satchel close, her knees to her chest. From inside, she could hear hymns being practiced, voices warm and out of reach. She didn't cry, not even then. But she did hum to herself, a lullaby her mother once sang while folding sheets in the kitchen. Something about roses and rivers. She wasn't sure of the words anymore. Morning found her curled beneath her satchel, lips blue, breath shallow. A shadow fell across her, and a moment later, a pair of gloved hands gently shook her shoulder. "You can't sleep here," a deep voice said. Not cruel, not kind either, just true. Her lashes fluttered open. The man above her was rough-faced and tall, dressed in a worn wool coat dusted with frost. A wide-brimmed hat shaded most of his features. I didn't mean to trespass," she rasped. "You'll die if you stay here." She blinked, swaying as she tried to sit up. He steadied her by the elbow. She didn't resist, though the fear was there in her eyes, sharp and brittle. "My name's Thomas Kane," he said. "Cabin's a mile south. Ain't much, but there's a stove." She hesitated. "I'm not offering anything but warmth and eggs. You'll be safer there than under God's snow." And so she nodded once. That's all she had strength for. He helped her onto the cart, wrapping an old blanket around her shoulders. The mule huffed as they set off, hooves muffled by snow. She didn't speak for the ride, and he didn't push her to. The cabin stood where the land opened up toward the dry riverbed, modest, weather-worn, and clean. Smoke curled from a chimney, smelling faintly of pine pitch. He lifted her down without asking. She stood on shaking legs, dignity in the way she didn't lean on him even when she almost fell. Inside, the heat was a bomb. A kettle hissed on the stove. Wooden walls held a carpenter's precision, everything shaped, fitted, cared for. Evelyn sat near the fire, hands outstretched like petals seeking sun. "I'll make eggs," Thomas said, already cracking them into a tin pan. "Bread's old, but there's molasses." She watched him quietly, her fingers twitching toward manners. "I'm not helpless," she said, though it came out barely more than a whisper. "I can earn my keep." "I didn't ask for anything," he replied. "You're half frozen and likely haven't eaten in a day." "Two," she admitted. "But I'm not a burden." He looked at her then, not harsh, just steady. "I didn't say you were." She ate in silence, each bite small and reverent. When she finished, she stood and asked where the wash bucket was. "You should rest." "I can't. If I sit too long, I'll feel useless." Thomas watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Bucket's out back. Wood stacked to the side. Don't go far." She smiled faintly. "You'd rather I stay close, in case I try to run off with your mule?" He didn't smile, but something softened in him just for a second. She stepped outside, and the cold met her like an old enemy. But her back was straighter now. She filled the bucket with half-frozen water, hauled it in. Her hands were red and raw before midday, but she refused to sit idle. From the hill above, Dry Willow whispered. Hazel Dobbins would surely hear by nightfall that the girl had found a roof, and tongues would wag. Mercy didn't often pass between strangers in that town without suspicion hitching a ride. Inside the cabin, Thomas chopped more wood than he needed. The rhythm calmed him. Her voice from the kitchen, soft, humming again, made the silence feel less heavy. Evenings settled with gold light and long shadows. She sat by the fire sewing a tear in her glove, while he smoked his pipe by the window, watching the clouds roll like bruises across the horizon. "You can stay," he said finally, without looking at her. "I won't overstay," she replied. "No one else will feed you. And it's cold again tomorrow." She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. Some things are better held in the quiet. Outside, the snow began again, light, as if even the sky was holding its breath. And though neither said it, they both knew. Something had shifted. A thread had been tied between them, thin, tentative, and trembling in the wind. The wind came down hard from the north that morning, driving sharp flurries against the cabin windows like 1,000 quiet accusations. Thomas Kane woke before light, as he always did, and moved through his morning chores without thought, stacking wood near the stove, feeding the mule, boiling coffee strong enough to kick dust off a trail. He expected the girl to still be sleeping. She'd been half frozen when he brought her in the day before, curled like a leaf too long from the tree. But when he opened the door to the kitchen, she was already there, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, wiping the worn counter with the determination of someone trying to earn a place in a world that hadn't offered one. "You should be resting," he said, voice rough as gravel. "I'd rather work," she replied without looking up. "You said eggs and bread were all there was. I found flour in the tin. I can make biscuits if you have lard." "I do." She paused, then nodded once, and moved to stoke the fire like she'd done it 100 times. There was no need for questions or permission. Not after last night. He watched her for a long moment. Her hands were small, but quick. Practical. She didn't fidget. Didn't look at him the way women used to. Not with hope, not with fear. She was building something, brick by quiet brick, and didn't seem to care whether anyone noticed. By the time breakfast was on the table, fluffy biscuits, scrambled eggs, weak coffee, he realized he hadn't spoken for 20 minutes. Neither had she. And yet, the air between them felt less empty than it used to. Later that morning, he hitched the cart. Had planned to head into town for nails, kerosene, and maybe a sack of oats. She stood at the threshold when he opened the door, shawl pulled tight, eyes unsure. "I'll be back by dusk," he said. She nodded. "You don't need to be afraid." "I'm not," she answered, though she didn't meet his eyes. But thank you for saying so. He climbed into the cart, gave a click of the tongue, and was gone. Dry Willow was a town of whispers. It looked painted by good intentions, but cracked along the grain, peeling church paint, uneven boardwalks, and men who remembered wars more clearly than their children's names. Thomas felt the stares as soon as he pulled into town. He tied the mule outside Hazel Dobbin's general store and went in, coat dusted with snow. Hazel looked up from behind the counter, with a smile practiced to near perfection. "Kane," she said sweetly. "Heard you took in that mail order stray." He said nothing, just grabbed a sack of oats. She was meant for Edgar Wiles, wasn't she? Poor girl. Guess he couldn't stomach the idea after seeing her. She was cold and starving, Thomas said quietly, placing the sack on the counter. "Of course," Hazel drawled. "But a man like you taking her in? Living alone all these years, and now suddenly, well, folks'll talk." Thomas met her gaze. "Then let 'em." Hazel clicked her tongue. "Suit yourself, Kane. But don't say I didn't warn you. A woman like that, who knows what kind of past she's run from?" He didn't answer, just paid and left. The rest of town was no kinder. A few nods, a few sidelong glances. One rancher spat near his boots and muttered something about a man losing his head over pity. Thomas ignored them all, but by the time he turned the cart back toward home, his shoulders felt heavier than the sacks beside him. When he arrived, the cabin smelled of soap and bread. She had cleaned the floor with pine water, washed every dish, and was now outside chopping kindling, though she clearly didn't know how, more swinging than slicing, more heart than technique. He took the axe from her gently. "You'll break your wrist like that." She straightened, cheeks red from cold and exertion. "I wanted to be useful." "You are." It slipped out before he meant it to. She looked up, surprised. He cleared his throat and split a log clean in two. "No one expects you to work yourself raw. If I don't, they'll say I'm lazy." "They'll talk anyway," he muttered. She knelt and stacked the firewood without another word. That evening, they sat by the fire, him in his usual chair, her curled on the rug with a blanket around her shoulders. A book lay open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in some time. "I know about the talk," she said finally. He didn't respond, but his eyes didn't leave the fire. "I heard it in town. Hazel. Others. What they say about me. People say things when they're bored. They say worse when they're afraid." At that, he glanced at her. She was watching the flames, lips pressed tight. "I didn't come out here to trap a man or shame one," she whispered. "I just didn't have anywhere else to go. My father drank. Sold off everything, including my name. My choices were this or worse." Thomas leaned forward, arms on his knees. "I'm not here to own you. You're not a debt." "No," she said quietly. "But I'm grateful." He looked down. "I didn't bring you in because I wanted a wife. I know. I just didn't want to bury another soul in the snow." That silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed grief, gratitude, something too early for love, but not too early for understanding. That night, he brought down a second blanket from the loft and laid it over her sleeping form. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. For the next few days, life settled into a rhythm. She cooked. He chopped. She cleaned. He repaired the barn door. Sometimes they worked in silence, and sometimes she hummed. Once, he found her sketching wildflowers in the margins of a book, using a bit of coal. Another time, he caught her watching the snow through the window, face soft with thought. They didn't speak of the future. That would have made things too real. One afternoon, as he repaired the broken fence post behind the barn, she brought him a canteen of water. "Let me help," she offered. He handed her the mallet, guided her grip. She was terrible at first, missing, slipping, cursing under her breath, but she laughed at her own mistakes, and something in that sound cracked him open a little. He hadn't heard laughter in that place since before the cough took his baby girl. As the sun dipped low and gold across the horizon, he looked at her beside him, cheeks flushed, hair undone, and thought, this is the first warmth that doesn't hurt. That night, after supper, she asked him why he never went to church anymore. "My wife's buried behind it," he said simply. "My daughter, too." She nodded. "Do you talk to them still?" "Only when I'm angry." She didn't press. The next morning, She left a small bouquet on the table, dried prairie blooms bundled in twine. A quiet offering. She didn't mention it, and neither did he. Later, when he went into town again, Hazel cornered him near the post office. "She still at your place?" she asked, voice as sharp as a chicken wire fence. Thomas adjusted the collar of his coat. "She is." "Well, if you won't claim her, the town will start assuming things." He looked at her, eyes cold. "Then let them assume." Hazel narrowed her gaze. "You'll regret it, Kane. Women like that, once fallen, they don't rise again." Thomas stepped forward, not menacing, just close. "Then maybe it's time someone helped them up." And with that, he turned, got into his cart, and headed home. That evening, the wind rose again, and Evelyn lit the lamps while Thomas brought in wood. He watched her from the doorway for a long moment, her silhouette framed by firelight, calm and purposeful. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "I told Hazel today that you're staying." She looked up. "Told her I didn't care what they said, that you belonged here." A beat passed. She walked toward him, slow and steady. "You mean that?" she asked. "I mean it." And though neither reached for the other, something passed between them, a pledge without ceremony, a promise without words. Outside, the sky was bruise purple, but inside the cabin, the world felt warm. They stood there in the hush of a shared decision, two souls who had lost everything, finally choosing not to be alone. And somewhere beyond that quiet, the snow kept falling. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, like the ticking of a long-wound clock. Days passed in small rituals that built something steadier than comfort, something closer to trust. Evelyn baked bread the way her mother once did, by feel and instinct, flour streaked across her cheek and fingers dusted with memory. The warmth of it filled the house before sunrise, and when Thomas woke, the scent pulled him from dreams he never remembered. He said little, but he noticed. How she refolded the towels and rewound the clock. How she added lavender to the wash water and read each night by lamplight with a book just close enough to chase loneliness. She didn't ask him questions. She didn't open doors he hadn't unlocked himself. But she left the space beside him unjudged, and that was its own kind of invitation. The snow began to melt in patchy, reluctant swaths across the pasture. By midweek, Thomas pulled out the broken fence posts behind the barn. Winter's winds had bowed them in, and something about their lean reminded him of people trying to stand after too much sorrow. He set to replacing them one by one, boots sinking into the thaw. Evelyn came out mid-morning with a basket of bread crusts and a small tin of butter. She offered no preamble, only sat on the upturned barrel and handed him a slice. "You don't talk much," she said, not accusing, just observing. He chewed, swallowed. Never saw the point of filling silences that don't need it. She nodded. "I like the quiet here. Feels honest." He looked up at her. She wasn't like the girls he remembered from back east. None of the perfumed sighs or fluttered lashes. She didn't try to draw his gaze. And still, it kept falling to her like sunlight over old wood. After they ate, she reached for the mallet. He paused. "I want to help," she said. "You said I belong here." Belonging means working too. He handed her the tool, showing her where to strike and how to angle the nails. Her grip was awkward at first, but she learned fast, listened, adjusted, tried again. They worked side by side until the sun softened and slid behind the hills. It was the closest they had come to laughter, the sound of her cursing the stubborn wood and his quiet chuckle when she nearly hit her thumb. Later that night, he found her by the stove, thumbing through a dog-eared copy of Pilgrim's Progress, her brow furrowed at the margins, which someone long ago had filled with slanted notes and faded ink. "You read that often?" he asked, surprising himself. She looked up, startled but not displeased. "Every winter. I like stories about people lost on roads who find something worth walking toward." He leaned against the doorframe. "Not many of those around here." "Not many roads," she agreed. A beat passed. "I used to read out loud," she said softly, "for my little brother, before he passed." "What happened?" "Fever. Took him fast." He nodded. Grief didn't need expanding. It wore the same coat, no matter the size. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. But when he pulled up the chair near the fire and tipped his hat back, she took it as permission. Her voice was even, soft without being sweet. The kind of voice that could mend broken seams in the soul if you let it. As the words filled the room, Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not forgiveness, but a kind of breathing he hadn't done in years. The next day, a letter arrived. Reverend Hawkins rode up the hill with it in his coat pocket, hat in hand, boots muddied from crossing the creek. Thomas stepped out to greet him while Evelyn stirred stew inside. "She's settling in well," the Reverend said. "Towns noticed." "I figured." "Some worry." "About what?" "She's not your wife, Thomas. Folks talk. You know that." Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers. "She's not a secret. She's not a sin." "Then call her something better than guest." He didn't respond. The Reverend left the letter, tipped his hat, and rode off. Inside, Evelyn set 2 bowls on the table, hands careful, eyes unsure. "Everything all right?" "Town's talking." "I guessed that already." Thomas sat, the steam from the bowl misting the air between them. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. "You haven't. But you will if I stay." He looked at her across the table, the flicker of lamplight softening the angles of her face. "I'd rather have trouble with them than silence in here." She smiled then, faint and fleeting. But it was the first smile not shaped by politeness, just hers, plain and unguarded. As March wore on, the fence stood straight and steady, and the cabin felt more like a home than it had in 5 winters. Evelyn hung herbs to dry from the beams, filled jars with lentils and dried beans, and even stitched curtains for the windows, thin muslin, but clean and blue as cornflowers. One afternoon, she found an old wooden box tucked beneath the floorboards while cleaning. Inside were baby shoes, a tiny dress, a lock of hair tied with faded ribbon. She didn't ask. That night, she left a fresh loaf of honeyed bread on the table beside the box. No note, no questions, just presence. Thomas stood in the doorway for a long while, hand resting on the edge of the table, the scent of honey rising into the quiet. They didn't speak of the box. They didn't need to. But the next day, he invited her to ride with him into town. "Won't that stir things up more?" she asked. "Probably," he said. "But I'm tired of letting ghosts drive the cart." So she wore her best dress, patched but pressed, and he cleaned the cart until the old would shone. As they rode past the church, past Hazel's shop, past men and women who watched with tight eyes and tighter mouths, Evelyn sat tall beside him, hands folded in her lap. Thomas said nothing, just let the reins loose and looked forward. She looked forward too. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Evelyn Rose Mercer felt not just sheltered, but seen. The wind howled like it had a memory. It clawed at the eaves of the cabin, rattled the shutters, and laid snow like a shroud across the pasture. A late storm had rolled down from the mountains, unexpected, brutal, and full of a kind of cold that seeps into old wood and older bones. Thomas had sealed the windows tight and stocked the firewood inside days before, but no one expected Evelyn to take sick. It began with a chill, barely more than a shiver in the morning. She had brushed it off with a tight smile, and a wool scarf knotted stubbornly at her throat. "I'm fine," she said. "Just the weather making my bones complain." By nightfall, her skin burned like the stove iron, and her breaths came shallow. Thomas found her curled on the cot, damp curls clinging to her forehead, eyes unfocused and glass-bright. "You should have told me sooner," he said, dampening a cloth and pressing it to her brow. "I didn't want to be trouble," she whispered. "You're not," he said, but she was already drifting again, caught in the tide of fever. The days blurred. Snow piled at the windows. The fire roared and dimmed and roared again. He sat by her side through the nights, changing cloths, coaxing sips of broth between dry lips, whispering things he hadn't said aloud in years. Not prayers exactly, he didn't know if he believed in those anymore, but fragments of them, softened by hope. She muttered in her sleep, sometimes nonsense, sometimes names he didn't recognize. Once she cried out for someone named Samuel. Once her voice caught in a sob, and she said, "Don't send me back." Thomas couldn't say what stirred in him then, some blend of rage and protectiveness so sharp it hurt his chest. He didn't know where she'd come from, not really, not the full shape of her sorrows. But he knew this. She belonged here now, with him, in this quiet place with its mended fences and flickering lamplight. And she would not die in it, not while he still breathed. He rode through the storm on the second morning, coat soaked through, snow freezing into his beard. Reverend Hawkins gave him fever tincture and a warning. Willow bark tea. Keep her warm. But it's a battle of the body, now, Thomas. All you can do is stay close. I know, he said. He returned with the wind screaming at his back, and the tincture clutched like treasure in his pocket. Evelyn was worse. Her skin pale as washed linen, her lips cracked, her pulse a flickering bird beneath her wrist. Stay with me, he whispered, brushing her hair back. You've already done the hard part, Rose. Just don't quit now. When the fire ran low, he brought wood. When her skin dried, he dampened it. When she moaned in pain, he spoke to her, not stories or comfort, but truths he hadn't told anyone since the ground froze over the graves of his wife and child. I never wanted to bury anyone again, he said, voice hoarse. And then you showed up with that suitcase full of nothing, and that chin held high. Damned if you didn't start stitching holes in the silence. She didn't stir, but he kept talking. You talk in your sleep, you know. You say things you won't in the daylight. I don't mind. I reckon I do too. Snow fell for 3 days straight. Time thickened like molasses. He stopped shaving. Slept in the chair, arms crossed on the side of the bed, boots still on. When he dreamed of the baby girl with fever-flushed cheeks and Evelyn's voice calling from far away. Then, late on the fourth night, she opened her eyes. Water, she croaked, barely audible. He sat up so fast the chair scraped back. Evelyn. She blinked slowly. Her lips cracked into a weak smile. You're back, he said. I didn't mean to go. He helped her sip water from a chipped cup, hand steady as stone. Her fingers brushed his, frail but warm. Why didn't you send me away? She asked. You're not a stray, he said simply. She closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her temple. The days after her fever broke moved slow and golden. The storm faded into memory, snow melting under a sun that returned with apology in its warmth. Evelyn regained her strength in pieces. First her voice, then her appetite, then her insistence on moving about the cabin, though he tried to keep her seated. You're still weak, he warned. I've been weaker, she said. He didn't ask what she meant, but in the quiet between sentences, he guessed. Reverend Hawkins came to check on her. She thanked him softly, and he told her she'd been lucky. I was more than lucky, she said, glancing at Thomas. The Reverend nodded. Then, maybe it's time luck had a name. They didn't talk about it then, but the seed had been planted. Outside, the snow receded, revealing patches of brown earth and stubborn winter grass. The world was coming back to life. One afternoon, she brought out the old rocking chair that had long gathered dust in the corner. She set it near the front porch and sat with a shawl around her shoulders, a book in her lap, and the wind curling softly around her ankles. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching. You never said why you chose to stay here when the world turned its back. She looked out across the fields. Because this place doesn't ask me to explain myself. It just lets me be. He stepped out and sat beside her on the porch rail. They didn't touch, but the air between them felt close. I buried a wife, he said, and a daughter. One winter. Same storm, same week. Cabin was colder back then. My soul, too. She nodded, saying nothing, letting the wind carry his pain out toward the hills. But this winter, he continued, someone left flowers on my table, and the silence didn't echo so loud. A crow called in the distance, sharp and clean. She turned to him, slow. I want to stay, Thomas. Not just for shelter. He looked at her, truly looked, and something in him nodded. I know. She reached out then, not for his hand, but to place hers on the railing beside his. Close. Not touching. Not yet. But close enough that warmth could travel. The last of the snow melted that night, and while the town of Dry Willow still whispered its judgments into the wind, the cabin on the hill held something stronger. Fragile, yes, but rooted now. Not in rescue. Not in pity. but in the slow, sure trust that grows between two souls who have seen the worst of the world and still believe in each other's worth. Spring was coming, and though the past hadn't vanished, it no longer ruled the house. Something else did now, something beginning to bloom. The thaw came slowly that year, as if the land itself had forgotten how to soften. Mud bled from beneath the snow, and the trees, still skeletal, shivered against pale blue skies. Down in Dry Willow, windows opened with caution, and gossip flowed freer than the river. It began with Hazel Dobbins, as things always did. Her words slithered from behind shelves and sewing circles, infecting each ear with her special brand of certainty. She's still living with him, she told the baker's wife, as if the fact itself was criminal. No vows, no ring, and he lets her sit in church like a lady. The news traveled faster than the wind off the prairie. By the second Sunday of April, murmurs turned to glares, then to a knock on Thomas Kane's door. Reverend Hawkins stood on the porch, hat in hand, lines of discomfort drawn deep on his face. Behind him, two men from town waited with arms folded and stony eyes. Men Thomas knew, worked beside, bought feed from, nodded to at market. "We need to talk," Hawkins said. Thomas stepped aside and let them in. Evelyn sat near the hearth, darning a sock, back straight despite the tension pouring through the room like smoke. She didn't rise. She didn't smile. Hawkins cleared his throat. "There's concern. From the community." Thomas remained silent. "They say a man of your standing, of your decency, shouldn't be cohabiting with a woman who isn't his wife." "She was half dead when I found her," he said evenly. "She was hungry and shamed and left to freeze. And I don't answer to the kind of people who turn a blind eye to that. It's not just about charity, Thomas. You've let her stay. Months now. People see what they see." Thomas looked at Evelyn. She returned his gaze with something fierce and steady. One of the townsmen spoke next, a wiry man with a mouth full of judgment and hands that hadn't seen calluses in years. "You either name her your bride or send her packing. Can't have it both ways." "Why?" Thomas asked, quiet and lethal. "Because it makes your wives uncomfortable to see a woman stand with pride after the world tried to break her." The man flushed, but didn't retreat. Hawkins stepped forward. "We're not here to shame you. We're here to ask your intention. It matters." Thomas crossed the room, slow and deliberate. He stopped beside Evelyn, then reached down, not for her hand, but for the darning needle she held, still glinting with thread. "She stitched this sock," he said. "Cooked every meal in this house. Nursed chickens, stacked firewood, read to me while I healed. She held my grief like it was her own." Evelyn blinked, but did not break. "She is not my burden," he continued, "nor my shame. She's my peace." For a moment, even the fire quieted. "Then marry her," the wiry man snapped. Thomas turned to Evelyn. "Is that what you want?" She looked around the room, at the judgment pressed into walls, at the reverend's regret, at the stares meant to push her small, and she stood. "I didn't ask for marriage," she said softly. "Not to save face, not to earn respect. I came here unwanted and built a home with what little I had left. I am not a scandal. I am a woman who survived." Then she stepped beside Thomas, chin lifted. "But if you're asking, and not out of shame, then yes. Yes, I'd marry you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ring, not new, not flashy. Worn gold, small and simple. The same one that had belonged to his mother, untouched since the day he'd buried the last woman who wore it. "I've had this for years," he said. "Couldn't bury it. Couldn't give it away. I didn't know why until now." He held it out. Evelyn took it, not with trembling or tears, but with the steadiness of someone who had earned every inch of joy that life had denied her. Hawkins nodded slowly. "I'll perform the ceremony. Tomorrow." The townsmen said nothing. One looked ashamed, the other uncertain. When they left, Evelyn sat down at the table and exhaled. Only then did her hand begin to shake. "Was that what you wanted?" she asked, eyes searching his. Thomas knelt beside her. "It's what I hoped for," he said. "But I would have let you go if it wasn't." "I wouldn't have gone," she whispered. He kissed her hand, just once, then stood and poured tea like nothing had changed, though everything had. The next day, beneath the cottonwood tree near the edge of his pasture, they stood before Reverend Hawkins. The town gathered, some out of curiosity, some with disapproval tucked into their collars, some with something gentler in their eyes. Evelyn wore her best dress, washed and pressed and smelling faintly of lavender. Thomas wore his father's vest and his cleanest boots. The vows were short, the silence longer. And when she placed the ring on his finger and whispered, "Home is here," he believed her. After the blessing, no one clapped. But no one turned away, either. They shared no kiss, not in front of them all. But when the last carriage rolled back to town, Thomas took her hand and walked her to the porch where a rocking chair waited. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" "For the peace that comes after the fight." She sat and rocked gently, face toward the wind. "I think I am." He sat beside her. That night, they danced inside the cabin. No music, no guests, just two people, scarred and stubborn, learning how to lean without falling. The lamplight stretched long over the floorboards, and their shadows moved like they'd done this before in another life. They didn't speak of promises. Didn't need to. Outside, dry willow slept. But the cabin, warm and golden, glowed like a kept secret. And from its quiet heart, love bloomed. Not loud, not swift, but rooted, deep, earned. Because some hearts aren't broken. They're simply waiting for the right hands to hold them. And sometimes healing doesn't arrive with thunder, but on steady feet, wearing a second-hand dress and the kind of smile that survives winter. So if you ever find yourself cast aside, turned away at the station platform, remember this. Not every salvation comes with noise. Sometimes it comes with bread, a steady fire, and a man who doesn't ask for your story before offering you a chair.